Kyiv officials say a Russian airstrike has killed at least 7 people in northern Ukraine. Among the dead is a 6-year-old child. The country's interior minister said the missile attack also wounded dozens when it hit the center of Chernihiv. People have been on their way to church to celebrate a religious holiday when the strike took place, the ministry said, adding 11 of the wounded were children. Ukraine's president condemned the strike, saying it hit a theater and a university. We are now joined by our correspondent in Kyiv, Matthias Berlinger. Matthias, what more can you tell us about the attack in Chernihiv and why this city in particular was targeted?
So we do not know, to start with this, why this particular city was targeted, but what we can conclude from what we have seen so far, that this was an attack on a civilian, on civilians. This was a city in the bright daylight of a Saturday with people on the streets, and hitting a city center at that time cannot be justified by any whatsoever military objects that might have been there or might have not been there. This was an attack on civilians. It's not the first time Russia has been hitting civilian infrastructure, residential buildings. We often do not know whether these buildings are really the target that Russia aimed at, because there is a range of missiles and rockets that have different levels of accuracy. Often it might just be that they have just taken into account that it might hit a civilian object, but might have tried to hit something else. But several missiles on the center of a city is, of course, an attack that takes into account civilian casualties, and that's why the Ukrainian service have opened a war crimes investigation on this attack.
You know, meanwhile, we understand that President Zelenskyy went to Sweden for talks. What are his interests there?
Sweden has been a fierce supporter of Ukraine since the beginning of the war. It was one of the first countries to allow weapons deliveries. If you remember, even before the war started, Britain and Sweden together delivered these NLAW anti-tank grenades that have proven quite effectively in stopping the Russian invasion. And since then, Sweden has delivered quite a few packages of arms and also civilian aid. So it is, of course, it is not one of the bigger countries in Europe. So maybe in total amount, these packages might not be at the top, but it's quite impressive for such a small country. So Sweden is an important supporter. Sweden is on its way into NATO. That's also something that Ukraine is interested, and similar things are, of course, also valid for its neighbors, Finland, for example. We do not know whether Zelenskyy will return to Ukraine after this visit, or whether other countries are on his agenda after that.
Many thanks, Matthias. DW correspondent Matthias Berlinger in Kyiv. Let's take a look now at some of the other stories making headlines. President Vladimir Putin has met his top generals in a rare trip to Russia's southern military command hub in Rostov-on-Don. The Kremlin said Putin listened to briefings by the chief of the Russian armed forces. The meeting came after Kyiv claimed some success on the battlefield this week. U.S. officials say the number of soldiers killed or wounded since Russia fully invaded Ukraine is close to 500,000. That figure includes 120,000 deaths among Russian forces, much higher than the 70,000 reportedly lost on the Ukrainian side.